Well, I'm late to the gun here with Obamacare having been ratified by the Supreme Court. The best hope of uh, defeating it is basically, at least legally, is gone. Uh, I think there'll be a lot of 10th Amendment stuff out there. Uh, I'm sure there'll be quite a bit. I don't know how effective it will be, and I don't know how much there'll be where I live. But I think it's really important at this point to uh, enunciate and put out there exactly what was wrong with healthcare and exactly what's going to happen now that Obamacare has come to pass. There's this very, very terrible um, symptom of rational ignorance that people tend to not analyze um, the causes for problems, especially social causes, because they're so complex. Empirically, it's impossible just to sort through the data and come to a conclusion because there is literally, practically speaking, an infinite amount of data. I mean, not literally, because infinity is infinity, but there are so many variables that are so often changing that you have to have some kind of coherent theory to even begin to sift through it. And since people have so little say when they vote, it really doesn't make sense for them to take the time before they come to policy conclusions. And so they don't. And unfortunately, uh, since people don't correctly diagnose social problems, they tend to give terrible uh, prescriptions. And I think that it's really important now to say, why is healthcare so messed up? Why Obamacare is not really addressing those problems. If anything, it's greatly exacerbating them. And maybe if enough people hear that argument, they'll realize that that's the source of the problem. Here's to hoping. Uh, Most people tend to uh, have a pretty good understanding, or at least an awareness of the law of supply and demand. They realize that if you restrict supply or increase demand and you don't change anything else, that the price is going to go up. And uh, medicine and medical care is something that a lot of people tend to think of as extraordinary or exceptional, but exactly how is not clear. So here I want to show, I think I'm going to have to split this up into a couple of videos and explain why the cost of healthcare is so high in the United States. And I think in this video I only want to address the supply side. So basically, if you restrict the supply on a good, there will be a higher cost for it. So if tomorrow Obama said that we're no longer going to import oil from overseas, the price of oil would go up because there would be a restriction. Or if he said uh, half the states that are currently producing oil must stop producing oil, we'd see a rise. If they said that half the gas stations had to close, the other half of the gas stations would be so crowded they'd end up raising prices. Uh, if they say plowed under half the crops across the country, then food prices would more or less double. It depends on which crops they plow under. And actually, in the past, the government, actually this is actually the case right now even, the government has a long history of actually destroying agricultural products in order to prop up the price. This got really popular in the Depression, which they thought was caused by falling prices. And so they wanted to raise prices, so they would kill pigs, plow under wheat, that sort of thing, in an attempt to raise prices. Well, the first restrictions on the supply of medical care that I'm aware of, and there may be others that I mean, this is not going to be a comprehensive list. I'm only going to think of a few things. All of them affected the price, but the first is through the AMA. Now, the AMA is not a government agency. It's a private organization, private association, American Medical Association of Doctors. And there was a point in time when to be a doctor, you didn't have to be a member of the AMA. You didn't have to have a license. You didn't have to have a degree or any qualifications whatsoever. Now, that doesn't mean that uh, people were going around and only getting treatment from quacks. If someone was a quack, they likely would not have been able to do very much business. If you were concerned about your health, you would have an interest in knowing how qualified the person was who was going to service you. And although it can sometimes not be easy to tell how qualified they are, if you're demonstrably terrible at it, you will likely not be in business for very long. If you can't demonstrate, say, by pointing out a degree or a reference, this would have been harder in the pre-internet age, but still possible. Doctors had to work very hard for their money. There was a lot of competition within the medical industry. And so doctors did things like they were always cutting prices, they were doing house calls. This is something that still exists in the cultural memory, so to speak. There are references to this in media. If you watch television shows, then they reference the olden days to them. If you watch a show from the 60s and they talk about the olden days, they could be talking easily about the teens or the 20s. Or even the late 1800s, if you read, like, say, a novel or something that was written earlier in the 20th century, they could be talking about times, in the late 19th century. Kind of the archetypal doctor isn't a hospital, it's a doctor coming to your door and treating you there. And doctors, like everyone else, are self-interested. And some doctors correctly realized that, I think all doctors realize this, but they didn't all act on it, that if they could somehow restrict the number of doctors, then each remaining doctor would be able to charge more. And so the American Medical Association basically lobbied the government for that reason. Now, it's pretty obvious when doctors are lobbying the government to restrict the number of doctors that they're doing that because they want to get a raise. They want to be able to charge higher prices. But they realize that to sell that politically, you can't say this industry wants to restrict its competition. It wants to become basically an oligopoly so that doctors can charge more. They have to make it sound altruistic, and so they would couch it in terms of, we want to protect the consumer from bad doctors. Now, bear in mind, I'm sure there were bad doctors, and I'm sure there are horror stories, although actually there's very few of which I've ever heard. There aren't that many that are actually in the historic record. It happened, but there was never a time, let's say there was a march on Washington of people who had been maimed by quack doctors, or family members who had been, or people who had had family or friends maimed or killed by quack doctors. That never happened. The March on Washington was by lobbyists for the AMA. And they would eventually, not initially or right away, were able to get licensure. And Congress, not really knowing that much about the medical profession, tends to defer to the industry that it's going to regulate. This is true in everything. When the government regulates, say, the petroleum industry, the so-called revolving door, which most people are aware of, the regulatory agency is going to be mostly staffed by washouts or the lower class underachievers from the petroleum industry. And so the relationship between the regulators and the regulated is not usually an antagonistic one. It's usually a symbiotic one. Sometimes even a very cordial, amenable, a friendly relationship. And this was certainly true with the AMA. Now, they have, over the years, introduced numerous additional requirements to practice law, and they've also instituted numerous, basically, what in big labor jargon are make-work schemes. So a make-work scheme is pretty common in lots of industries. For instance, I was once at a university. It's not important why. I was in high school, but someone had pulled the fire alarm, and it was a weekend. And there was no fire or anything. Someone had pulled it on accident. Apparently, there's no foul play. And it took 2 hours to turn it off. Now, there was someone there right then who could turn it off. He knew how. He had the key. He had every physical capability to do it. But in their contracts, in the union contracts, it said that for the fire alarm to be turned off, 2 people had to be present, even though it's a one-person job, and that is simply so 2 employees will get paid. It makes it cost more, at least twice as much, and in this case meant that the fire alarm went off for 2 hours, and is actually in January, so people were out in the cold. Um, and a lot of this came about in the 30s, but labor has kind of wanted it for a long time. Anyway, in the medical industry, that's one of the things you'll see is a lot of procedures and tasks that could be performed by anybody, uh, like a nurse or even just some kind of janitor or something, that will be mandated to be performed by a doctor. That way a doctor will be able to claim salary on it, they'll be able to charge for it. Other restrictions, they restrict the number of medical schools. Part of this is related to accreditation. There is an oligopoly based on accreditation. And accreditation really does not have anything to do with how well you teach or the pedagogy of a school or the results of how well the student body does after graduation. It's purely a political thing. In fact, the process of getting accreditation is damn near impossible, and it's actually much easier just to find a bankrupt school that already has it than to try and get it yourself. Uh, but on top of that, they actually set limits to how many people can be in medical school. And if you know anyone who's applied, I have a couple, actually a big number of my friends in college subsequently attended and finished medical school. I have some relatives who are in it right now, and they turn away almost everyone. I think not us to say everyone that they turn away would suddenly become a doctor, but the supply would certainly increase. They restrict the number of hospitals. This isn't always a federal government thing. A lot of municipalities simply won't allow it. Depends on the state, but usually there is some kind of government agency that has veto power. Basically, you can't just build one and pay a fee or whatever. They can say, we don't want you to build one. That's the end of the story. And usually there's going to be a couple layers. If the municipality doesn't, the state might, and sometimes, depending on the scenario, maybe even the federal government, although I couldn't say for sure. In any event, preventing new hospitals from being built, preventing new people from becoming doctors, and mandating that doctors be present for all kinds of things that they aren't necessarily needed for, all of that's going to reduce the supply. And that's the point. The point isn't quality control. If I could say right now, as a quality control measure, let's fire the half of doctors who are the least performing. So all the doctors in the country, let's get rid of the lower 50%. I can make that sound really, oh, now only, after that, the very worst doctors will be basically the average doctors today. And so the average, skill level of doctors will go up, yes, but there'll be only half as many, and so the actual quantity of healthcare available will be drastically reduced, and the aggregate care that can be given by the industry will be catastrophically reduced, and it would be a disaster, right? Well, we're not talking about, if you say, well, we're just going to restrict the number not by half but by 10%. Well, that's still a reduction. So the supply of doctors is, and it's not just doctors, it's nurses, it's hospitals, it's the equipment. The equipment, I mean, just little things like even medical tape. Medical tape is not that dissimilar from just duct tape or electrical tape. Maybe there's some sanitarial differences, but not many. But to market your good and to sell your good for medical uses is not something that any business can just start doing, even if they can make an identical product. So the state greatly restricts the supply. And in addition to that, it makes the supply, by mandating all these years of education, much more expensive. It doesn't take 4 years of a bachelor's degree and then 4 more years of medical school for someone to be able to do some type of healthcare. I mean, the military, for instance, has people performing really life-saving surgeries for far less training. I think, and I hate using the military as a source, but they've done studies, and you can take the average person and have them do very least relatively skilled tasks with just 9 weeks, something like that. And I'm not advocating that every brain surgeon be that way, but it's absolutely insane to say that people have to jump this enormous hurdle and before they're even allowed to touch a scalpel or wear a lab coat or have anything to do with medical treatment. Some people will still go through. The other thing is just education generally. The cost is vastly inflated for similar reasons that healthcare is inflated. I'll come to that later when we talk about demand. But when you have people going into $250,000 debt to become a doctor, they're very much in that point need the higher inflated prices. Where if becoming a doctor didn't cost anything, and people say, how would it cost anything, you libertarian utopian? Well, you could work into becoming a doctor. Hospitals want to do business, they want to have customers, and they want good doctors, and they would say, if you can come work for us, if we think that you're promising, we'll pay for whatever education is necessary as part of your pay. So they wouldn't pay you very much in cash. Maybe they'd give you the training, maybe even in the hospital or perhaps in some school. It probably would vary quite a bit, and you would basically be earning money right away. And there's nothing implausible about that, and at that case you would never even go into debt, or perhaps you'd go into much less debt. And even though some doctors would probably still want to go to the highest class, most expensive academy of higher surgical learning, which very well could be even more expensive than the average school today, that would only be a fraction of the doctors, and so the overall cost for or price of healthcare wouldn't be that radical. Now I already talked about, say, I mentioned tape, but MRI machines, every piece of medical technology is heavily restricted, and probably the most restrictive, the thing that increases the price the most is drugs. The FDA has basically made it so that to introduce a new drug costs $1 billion and takes 10 years. That means that you have to make a lot of money per pill, even though the physical cost of creating most drugs is not infinitesimal, but tiny in comparison to its price. But the price is for the 10 years of R&D necessary. And I know that there are arguments here for drugs. The whole counter argument here is, yes, you're right, it raises prices, but it's worth it because we get more safety. Well, unfortunately, most people don't even make that connection, and so they view the FDA and the restrictions and licensure and all that, and they don't actually, for a minute, even realize that it raises the price. So they don't attribute that when they say healthcare is expensive, they don't go, well, part of that is because we want all this FDA, licensure, AMA, all that stuff, which is really very grating for people to advocate something that is clearly going to raise prices, then bitch about those prices, and refuse to acknowledge that what they advocate, at the very least, contributes to those higher prices. But it does. And one has to ask themselves, how is it that you could say, well, I'm satisfied. I think it's good that it takes 10 years and $1 billion to get a drug legalized. But that's a very arbitrary cutoff point, because I could say, well, sometimes the drugs that they offer are still dangerous. In fact, whenever you see a commercial for a drug, they almost always have rather hilarious disclaimers about all the terrible things that can happen if you take those drugs. And so I could say, quite logically, I think it should take 20 years and $2 billion to get drugs certified by the FDA. And there's no basis for you to say that's too much. Because if you're going to say 1 billion years and 10, it's a completely arbitrary distinction. And so that should be left up to the people who want to buy the drugs, the people who want to sell the drugs. Again, I don't think retailers of drugs are going to want to be selling rat poison. If a hospital was giving out rat poison, I think they'd lose business pretty bad. And even if their clientele was too stupid to realize that they were being sold shit, their competitors would have every incentive to point out, hey, that hospital is selling you drugs that are no good. Just like even though the regular person might not have the wherewithal to take on McDonald's and point out maybe tainted beef or whatever, Burger King does have the wherewithal to do that, and so does Wendy's and Subway and every other business out there. And they'd have every incentive to, have secret shoppers go in there and get the drugs and test them and know what they're made out of and know what they can do. And so I think the fears there make sense, but they're also way out of context. And they also could be, I mean, we could say, well, look, too many people are doctors now. We should make it so that medical school takes 25 years. And, because there's still mistakes that happen as we have. So the price, the supply is just enormously restricted. And that's going to raise the price. How much has it raised it? I can't say. I'd say it's probably a dramatic amount. We're not talking about a 5 or 10% decrease. If you were to add on all the layers I've mentioned here, if all the drugs were cheaper, if all the medical equipment was cheaper, if there were more hospitals, if there were more doctors and more nurses and more staff, and it costs less for them to become qualified to do what they're doing, I think that all adds up to not just a slight or a statistical decrease, but an order of magnitude decrease in the price. And without a similar decrease in quality. So rather than make this become an hour-long video, I think I'm going to do another one on demand, which is the other side of the curve here, which I believe would have a similar sized reduction. So that's it. The government is pretty much the only body responsible for restricting the supply. When we get to demand, there are actually other things like insurance companies that can be at least partially blamed, although even there the government has a conspicuous role. But the supply is restricted on many, many levels, and that pushes the price up. And people need to realize that. So, all right.